Jake Carter was a man who lived alone in the wild, dusty stretches of the Arizona desert. His cabin, made of rough-hewn wood and stone, stood far away from any town or settlement. The land around him was harsh and unforgiving, but it was the perfect place for a man like Jake, who sought nothing more than peace and solitude. Jake had come to the West from Texas years ago, looking for something different, something beyond the crowded cities and endless noise. He had been a cowboy all his life, and the wild, open spaces called to him like nothing else ever could. He loved the freedom, the sense that no one could tell him what to do or where to go. Out here it was just him, the land, and his thoughts. Every morning Jake would rise early, saddle his horse, and check on the cattle. The ranch was small, but it was enough to keep him busy. The heat of the day would beat down on him, and the evenings would cool, bringing a slight relief. But it was always quiet, too quiet. There were no neighbors, no friends, and not many visitors. Jake didn't mind. He preferred it that way. One afternoon, Jake was out checking the cattle again. His boots kicked up the dry dirt as he rode across the rolling hills that surrounded his cabin. He had no particular reason to be out this far, but something about the endless expanse of the desert made him feel at ease. The horizon stretched out before him, and he felt like he could see the whole world. It was a feeling that made him feel small, but at the same time free. He rode for hours, past jagged rocks and sparse shrubs, until he came upon a little creek. He stopped there, dismounted, and let his horse drink. As the horse bent its head to the water, Jake sat on a rock, looking out at the land. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful sight he had come to love. But as he sat there, something unusual caught his eye. A figure appeared on the horizon, moving towards him at a steady pace. At first he thought it might be a traveler or another cowboy, but as the figure drew closer, he realized that it was not a man at all. 3 women were riding toward him on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. Jake squinted, unsure of who they were or what they wanted. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he didn't draw it. There was something about their calm, purposeful ride that told him they weren't here to cause trouble. The 3 women were dressed in traditional Apache clothing, long, flowing skirts, beaded necklaces, and shawls draped over their shoulders. Their horses moved gracefully over the uneven terrain, and each woman seemed to carry herself with a quiet strength. When they finally reached Jake's spot by the creek, they stopped, dismounting with practiced ease. The youngest of the 3, a girl with dark eyes and a mischievous smile, stepped forward first. "We've been traveling for days," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We need shelter for the night." Jake studied her face, noting the confident look in her eyes. There was no fear there, no hesitation. It was as if they knew exactly where they were going and why. He nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. 3 women, Apache by the looks of it, all alone in the desert. What were they doing here? Why had they come all the way out to his cabin? But he didn't ask. Instead, he decided to extend the hospitality he was known for among those who crossed his path. "My cabin's not far from here," Jake said, motioning with a hand. "You can rest there for the night." The youngest girl smiled, but it was the older one who spoke next. She had a serious expression, her face showing the wisdom of someone much older. "We appreciate your kindness," she said. "But be warned, cowboy. We are not just any travelers. We are Apache." Jake didn't flinch. He had heard stories about the Apache before, of course. Some of them were exaggerated, some were true, but he had always respected their way of life. The Apache were fierce, skilled, and resourceful. They didn't take kindly to being treated like strangers on their own land, and Jake had always respected that. "I know who you are," Jake said simply, "but that doesn't change the fact that I have a warm cabin and a fire. You're welcome to join me." The 3 women exchanged looks, and after a moment the older woman nodded. "We will take you up on your offer," she said. "Thank you." Jake led them back to his cabin, the women following behind him on their horses. As they walked, Jake couldn't help but watch them. They had an air about them, strong, independent, and capable. They didn't seem afraid of the desert or of anything else for that matter. They seemed at home in the wild, and Jake couldn't help but respect that. By the time they arrived at his cabin, the sun had set completely, and the desert was bathed in the soft light of the stars. Jake prepared a fire, and they all sat around it eating the simple meal that Jake had prepared. As they ate, the women spoke little. but their presence was enough to make the evening feel different from any other Jake had ever experienced. After the meal, the youngest woman, whose name Jake learned, was Lenny, was the first to speak. "So, cowboy," she said with a sly grin, "can you handle us all?" Jake raised an eyebrow, surprised by her directness. The two older women, Tawny and Sita, laughed softly, and Jake couldn't help but smile. "I've handled more than a few tough situations in my time," Jake replied, keeping his tone light. "I think I can manage." The conversation turned to stories of the desert, and Jake found himself listening more than talking. Tawny, the oldest, spoke with the calm authority of someone who had seen much in her years. Sita, the middle one, was more playful, teasing Jake every chance she got. Lenny, the youngest, was a mix of both, curious and full of life, but with an underlying strength that Jake couldn't ignore. As the night wore on, the fire crackled, and the stars above seemed brighter than ever. Jake found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he had been looking for. A reminder that even in the harshest places, people could still find each other. Little did he know, the next few days would change his life forever. The next morning, Jake awoke early as he always did. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to break over the desert hills, casting a soft glow across the land. He stepped outside, breathing in the cool morning air. The desert was alive in its own quiet way. Birds chirping, the wind rustling through the sparse trees, and the occasional sound of hooves in the distance. It was a peaceful place, yet it always felt alive with possibility. As Jake went about his usual morning routine, feeding the horses, checking the cattle, and ensuring everything was in order, he couldn't help but think about the three women who had arrived the night before. Tawny, Sita, and Lenny. The names echoed in his mind, and he found himself wondering about them. About what had brought them so far into the desert, so far from their people. They had seemed different from any women Jake had met before, strong, capable, and confident. Tawny, the eldest, had a quiet authority about her, as if she carried the weight of many years and experiences. Sita, the middle one, had a spark in her eyes, a mischievous energy that reminded Jake of a wild stallion, and Lenny, the youngest, seemed to hold a combination of both. Youthful energy mixed with a surprising amount of maturity. As Jake worked, he glanced over at the cabin, where the women were beginning to stir. They had stayed inside for the night, resting after their long ride. Jake knew they had been traveling for days, but he hadn't asked them why they were out here. There was something about the way they had entered his life that made him hesitate to pry. The women soon came out of the cabin, stretching and yawning in the morning light. Tawny was the first to approach Jake, her expression serious but friendly. "Good morning, cowboy," she said. "I hope we didn't trouble you last night." Jake smiled and nodded. "No trouble at all. I'm just glad to have some company for once." Tawny gave him a small, knowing smile. "We're glad for the shelter. It's been a long journey." Sita and Lenny joined them, and the group fell into an easy conversation. It was clear that Jake was no longer just offering them a place to stay. Something had shifted overnight. These women weren't just strangers passing through, they had become something more. And Jake, for the first time in a long while, felt something stir within him, a sense of belonging, of connection. After a quick breakfast, the women suggested they go for a ride. Jake wasn't sure what they had in mind, but he agreed, eager for the opportunity to learn more about them. The four of them saddled their horses and set off into the desert, the soft clopping of hooves the only sound that broke the silence. As they rode, the women spoke more freely about themselves. Tawny explained that they were from a nearby Apache band, one that had been traveling in search of safer lands. There had been tensions with settlers in the area, and their people had been pushed farther into the desert. Tawny's words were measured, calm, but there was a hint of sadness in her voice, a quiet acknowledgement of the struggles their people had faced for years. "We've had to move many times," she said, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Each time we lose something, our homes, our way of life, our land." Jake could sense the weight of her words. It was clear that Tawny cared deeply for her people, and she had seen more than her fair share of hardship. But there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet resolve. It was the kind of strength Jake admired. Sita, who had been riding beside Jake, spoke up next. "I've heard stories of cowboys and their land. It's funny," she said, her voice light. "I never thought I'd meet one like you." Jake chuckled, not sure how to respond. "I'm just a cowboy, nothing special." "Oh, I don't know about that," Sita teased. "You've got this place all to yourself, out here in the middle of nowhere. You must be doing something right." Jake gave her a wry smile. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to leave." Lenny, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up, her voice full of curiosity. "Why did you leave Texas?" Jake was surprised by the question. He hadn't told them much about his past, but it seemed that Lenny wanted to know. There was something about the way she asked the question. It wasn't just idle curiosity. She wanted to understand him, to know what made him tick. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "I came out here looking for something," he said slowly. "I didn't know what it was at first. I guess I just needed a place where I could be alone, where I could think. I was tired of the noise, the people, the expectations. Out here there's nothing but land. It's the only thing that makes sense to me." Lenny nodded as if she understood. There was a silence between them for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes from two people sharing something real, something deep. The ride took them deeper into the desert, and Jake found himself more and more intrigued by the Apache girls. They weren't like anyone he had ever met. There was a quiet strength in them, something he couldn't quite put into words. They were not afraid of the world. They seemed to embrace it even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous. As the day wore on, the desert around them began to change. The hills grew steeper, and the landscape became rockier, more rugged. Tawny led the group, her horse moving with ease over the uneven terrain. Sita followed closely behind, laughing as she raced ahead, challenging Jake to catch up. Lenny rode beside him, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. Eventually, they came to a small valley surrounded by tall cliffs. It was a beautiful place, quiet and still as if it had never been touched by anyone. The girl stopped, and Jake followed suit, dismounting and stretching his legs. "This is where we camped last night," Tawny said, glancing around the valley. "We've been traveling for a while now, and this is the only place that feels like home." Jake nodded, taking in the beauty of the place. He could understand why they would feel that way. The valley was peaceful, untouched by the world outside. It was a place where one could breathe, where the land seemed to whisper its secrets. As they set up camp, Jake couldn't help but feel a growing sense of respect for these women. They were strong, capable, and wise beyond their years. They had a deep connection to the land, and Jake could see that they were not just surviving. They were thriving in a world that often seemed determined to push them down. That night, as they sat around the fire, the stars above them shining brightly, Jake felt a strange sense of contentment. He had always lived alone in the desert, but now with these Apache girls by his side, it didn't feel so lonely anymore. Little did Jake know, the journey that had begun with a simple offer of shelter would lead him into a world of adventure, danger, and deep connection. One that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The days that followed were unlike any Jake had experienced before. The arrival of the three Apache women, Tawny, Sita, and Lenny, had disrupted the calm rhythm of his life, but in a way that felt natural, even welcome. The solitary cowboy who had spent years alone in the desert now found himself sharing stories, laughter, and the silence of the wilderness with three strong, capable women. It was an odd feeling, but not an unwelcome one. Tawny, the eldest, had a calm, commanding presence. She rarely spoke unless necessary, but when she did, her words carried weight. She was the type of person who didn't need to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. Her presence was enough. Sita, on the other hand, was lively and full of energy. She liked to tease Jake, challenging him in ways that made him laugh more than he cared to admit. Lenny, the youngest, was quieter than the others, but there was a depth to her that Jake couldn't quite place. She had an old soul, as if she carried the weight of many lifetimes in her eyes. As the days passed, Jake became more and more drawn to each of them, not just for their beauty or strength, but for their resilience and their way of seeing the world. They had lived through hardships Jake couldn't fully understand, and yet they seemed to carry it with grace and dignity. There was no bitterness in them, no sense of defeat. Instead, they seemed to accept the challenges life threw at them with a quiet determination. It was a quality Jake admired, something he had seen in himself at times but never so clearly in others. The mornings were filled with work. The four of them would rise early, before the sun had fully risen, and spend the day tending to the cattle and making sure the camp was in good shape. Jake had always been a skilled cowboy, But the Apache girls taught him things he had never known before. Tawny, with her steady hand and experienced eye, showed Jake how to track animals across the rough desert terrain. Sita, full of energy and laughter, taught him how to ride at a faster pace, how to push a horse to its limit while still maintaining control. Lenny, who was quieter, had a way with animals that Jake found mesmerizing. She seemed to communicate with them in a way he had never seen before, moving with a quiet grace that made even the most stubborn animals follow her lead. Jake, in turn, taught them what he knew about cattle, about surviving in the desert, and about the ways of the cowboy. But as the days wore on, he realized that they weren't just learning from him, they were teaching him too. He had spent so much time alone, never thinking that he might need anything beyond his own knowledge. But these women brought something to his life that he hadn't realized he was missing. They brought a connection to something bigger, something beyond the solitude he had always sought. One afternoon, after a long day of work, they gathered around the campfire, as they had done each night. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on their faces. Jake, feeling unusually at ease, leaned back against a rock and stretched his legs out in front of him. The desert night was cooler than it had been during the day, and the stars above shone brightly as if watching over them. Tawny sat closest to the fire, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. She looked at Jake, her expression unreadable. "You know, Cowboy," she said softly, "you're not like most of the men we've met. You're different." Jake glanced over at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "How so?" She paused for a moment as if searching for the right words. "Most men who live out here, they come to the desert to escape something. They're running away from their past or from something they've done. But you," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you're not running. You've chosen this life. You've made peace with it." Jake looked into her eyes, surprised by the depth of her insight. He hadn't realized that his reasons for living alone in the desert were so apparent. But she was right. He hadn't come here to escape anything. He had come because in the vastness of the desert, he had found peace. It wasn't a peace that came easily or naturally. It was a peace that came from solitude, from being alone with his thoughts, and from knowing that he was free to live as he chose. He nodded slowly. "I guess you could say that. I've always been more at peace out here than anywhere else." Sita, who had been listening in silence, suddenly grinned and jumped to her feet. "Well, if that's the case, then you're really going to love tomorrow." She danced around the fire, her energy infectious. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's going on tomorrow?" Sita winked. "You'll see, but trust me, Cowboy, you're not going to want to miss it." The next day, Sita led Jake and the others into the desert once more, this time toward a small canyon that lay hidden among the hills. The ride was fast, with the wind whipping past them, and Jake found himself enjoying the speed and freedom of it. He had ridden hard before, but never with such abandon. Sita's joy in the ride was contagious, and for a moment, Jake forgot all about the desert's quiet isolation. When they reached the canyon, Jake was surprised to see that it was not just a natural formation. It was a place the Apache girls had used as a secret meeting ground. Tawny and Lenny led Jake down into the canyon, where they showed him a series of petroglyphs, ancient symbols carved into the rock by their ancestors. The artwork was beautiful, telling stories of times long past. Each carving represented a different part of Apache history, stories of great hunts, of battles fought, and of their people's connection to the land. Jake stood silently, taking it all in. He had seen many things in his life, but nothing quite like this. The symbols on the rock seemed to speak to him, to tell him of a world that was older than anything he could comprehend. He realized then that the Apache were not just survivors of the land. They were its stewards, its protectors. They had a deep, unbroken connection to the earth that Jake could only begin to understand. Tawny, who had been watching him, spoke up quietly. "This is our heritage. It is our story." Jake turned to her, his eyes filled with wonder. "It's incredible," he said softly. Lenny, who had been standing by, smiled at him. "It is," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "And now it's yours too." Jake looked at the petroglyphs once more, feeling a deep sense of connection. In that moment, he realized that the world he had known, his life as a cowboy, was only a small piece of something much bigger. These women, their people, their culture, they were part of something that had existed long before the cowboys and settlers arrived. And somehow in this vast desert, Surrounded by ancient history and untold stories, Jake had become a part of it all. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of red and orange, Jake understood that his life had been changed forever. The bond he had formed with these Apache women, strong, proud, and wise, was a connection he would carry with him always. It was a reminder that, even in the harshest deserts, there could be unexpected beauty, and even the loneliest of men could find a place where they truly belonged. The days that followed were peaceful, but Jake had an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was the kind of feeling you get when something is about to change, and you don't know if it's for the better or for the worse. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Jake and the three Apache women grew stronger. They had become an unexpected part of his life. Tawny, Sita, and Lenny were not just visitors. They were a part of his world now, their presence filling the silence that had once defined his existence in the desert. However, despite the newfound peace, something stirred in the distance, a feeling Jake couldn't shake off, like a storm on the horizon, something that was approaching but hadn't yet arrived. It started with the quiet whispers that floated on the wind, rumors of trouble from settlers moving deeper into the Apache territory, pushing their way into lands that had belonged to the Apache for generations. The news was unsettling, and it seemed to grow more real every day. Tawny had always been the most composed of the three women, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of worry that came from something small, like a passing storm or a fleeting problem. No, this was the kind of worry that came from knowing something big was coming, something that couldn't be avoided. One afternoon, as they sat around the fire outside the cabin, Tawny finally spoke up, her voice low and serious. "We've been hearing rumors from the other tribes," she said, her eyes dark with concern. "Settlers are coming closer, pushing into our lands. And it's not just small groups, it's organized. They're looking to take more land." Jake's heart sank. He had heard the stories too, but he hadn't realized how close the threat was. He had lived in the desert long enough to know that the land meant everything to the Apache people. It wasn't just about survival, it was about culture, heritage, and family. If settlers encroached on this land, it wasn't just an invasion of space. It was an attack on the very soul of the Apache people. "How close are they?" Jake asked, his voice tight. Tawny's gaze flickered toward the horizon. "Close enough to be a real threat. They've been pushing northward and their numbers are growing. They won't stop until they've taken it all." Sita, who had been listening quietly, suddenly stood up, her expression fierce. "We can't just sit here and let them take what's ours." Lenny, who had been silent until now, added softly, "We've been running for too long. It's time to stand and fight." Jake felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had never thought of himself as a warrior, but as he listened to the women, something stirred inside him. He had always been a fighter in his own way, a cowboy who had learned to survive the harshness of the desert. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for what was right, for what belonged to the Apache people. "I'm with you," Jake said quietly, his voice steady. "I've spent my life in the desert, but I'm not going to sit back and watch this happen. I'll fight alongside you." The three women looked at each other, and for the first time Jake saw something in their eyes, something deeper than the bond they had formed with him. It was gratitude, but also a quiet acceptance. They knew that Jake wasn't just some cowboy anymore. He had become a part of their struggle. That night, as the sun set and the stars began to take their places in the sky, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change forever. The desert, which had once felt like a place of peace and isolation, now seemed like a battleground. The stillness of the night felt heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The next day, Tawny led them to a hidden camp deep in the hills, away from the cabin. It was a place where the Apache had gone before when they needed to regroup or hide from danger. As they rode deeper into the hills, Jake couldn't help but marvel at how well Tawny knew the land. She moved with confidence, guiding them through the rugged terrain as though she could see the land itself, feeling it beneath her feet. When they reached the camp, Tawny called a meeting. Sita and Lenny gathered around a small fire, and Jake sat beside them, listening intently as Tawny outlined the situation. "We can't fight the settlers in open battle," Tawny said. "They're too many and they're too well armed. But we know this land better than they do. We'll use the desert to our advantage. We know every rock, every trail, every hidden pass." Jake nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "We need to find out exactly where they are," Tawny said. "We need to know how close they are and how many of them there are. We'll use scouts, but we can't take any chances. We need to be ready." Jake's mind immediately went to work. He was a cowboy after all. He knew the desert like the back of his hand, and he had the skills to track and scout. He was used to working alone, but now he would be working with the Apache women. It felt strange, but also right. He had always respected their ways, and now he had a chance to help protect the land they had taught him to love. Over the next few days, Jake and the Apache women went on scouting missions, moving through the desert under the cover of darkness. They tracked the movements of the settlers, watching from the shadows as they camped and moved through the terrain. Jake learned quickly how to use the desert to his advantage. He learned how to move silently, how to read the signs the land left behind, and how to keep a low profile while gathering important information. The more they learned, the clearer it became that the settlers weren't just passing through. They were setting up permanent camps, building homes and structures. They were preparing to stay. The Apache had no choice but to act. If they didn't, their way of life would be lost forever. One night, as Jake returned from a scouting mission with Tawny, they sat by the fire, both tired but focused. The air was cool and the fire crackled softly. "We have to make a decision," Tawny said, her eyes serious. "We can't wait any longer. The settlers are getting closer. We have to fight." Jake nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. "I'll stand with you. Whatever it takes." The Apache women didn't hesitate. They had been ready for this moment for a long time. They had known that their land, their culture, was always at risk. But now they would fight for it. They would fight for their ancestors, for their future, and for the land that had always been theirs. The night grew colder, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Jake looked around at the faces of the three women, Tawny, Sita, and Lenny. He saw strength in their eyes, but also a quiet sadness. They had fought so much in their lives. They had lost so much. But now they were ready to fight again. As the stars twinkled overhead, Jake knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. It would test them all. But one thing was certain. They would fight together and they would never give up. The desert was their home, and they would protect it with everything they had. The morning dawned cold and still, as if the desert itself was waiting for what was about to unfold. Jake stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of the desert. The sun had barely begun to rise, and the first light of day painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a beautiful sight, but Jake felt no peace in it. The calm before the storm had settled over the land, and he knew the battle was drawing near. The Apache women, Tawny, Sita, and Lenny, were already up, preparing for what lay ahead. They moved with quiet determination, each one focused on the task at hand. Jake could see the strength in their eyes, but there was also a deep sorrow, a sorrow that came from knowing they were about to fight for everything they had ever known. They had spent the last few days preparing, scouting, and gathering what little information they could about the settlers' movements. The settlers had grown bolder, setting up camp closer to the Apache lands with each passing day. It was clear now that they weren't just passing through. They were here to stay, and they had no intention of leaving without taking what they wanted. Tawny had been the one to make the final decision. "We can't let them take our land. If we do, it's not just the land we lose. We lose our way of life. We lose our culture. And we lose our people," she had said. "We fight or we disappear." Jake had known that it would come to this. He had seen the way the Apache women fought for their land, their families, and their traditions. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their identity. And now, they would have to face an enemy that was far too large and too well armed for them to defeat through force alone. The plan was simple. Use the desert to their advantage. The Apache knew the land better than anyone, and they would use the terrain to create an ambush. They would divide into small groups, moving silently through the night, and strike at the settlers when they least expected it. Jake's role was clear. As a cowboy, he knew the land well, and he had experience in tracking and hunting. He would serve as a guide, helping the Apache women navigate the terrain and stay hidden until the time was right. They would need to move quickly and silently, and Jake's skills would be crucial in making sure they were always one step ahead of the settlers. As the day wore on, Jake and the women made their final preparations. Tawny spoke with each member of their small group, ensuring that everyone knew their role. Sita sharpened her knives while Lenny gathered supplies. The tension in the air was thick, but there was also a quiet sense of purpose. The Apache were ready, and Jake had never seen them so focused. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they set out under the cover of darkness. The desert, which had once been a place of solitude for Jake, now felt alive with purpose. The wind rustled through the brush and the faint sound of hooves echoed in the distance. The stars above shone brightly, but they provided little comfort. Tonight, the desert would be a battlefield. The ride was long and silent. The Apache women moved with the grace of shadows, their horses gliding over the sand with barely a sound. Jake rode at the back, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for any sign of danger. The wind had picked up, and the air felt colder as they approached the settlers' camp. When they arrived, Jake and Tawny crouched low behind a rocky outcrop, watching the camp in the distance. The settlers' fires flickered in the night, and Jake could see their tents and wagons scattered across the land. There were at least 30 men, all armed, with no sign of the women or children that Jake knew often accompanied the settlers. It was clear that this was not just a group of travelers. It was a small army preparing for a long stay. "They're ready," Jake whispered. "They're not leaving anytime soon." Tawny nodded, her face grim. "Then we strike tonight. We don't wait until they have time to dig in. We have to take them by surprise." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of knowing that lives would be lost. There would be no going back once the first arrow was fired. But he knew there was no other choice. The Apache had fought for their land for generations, and tonight would be no different. The plan was set. Sita and Lenny would lead a small group to the settlers' rear, creating a distraction. At the same time, Jake and Tawny would take the front, using the terrain to approach the camp unnoticed. Once they were in position, the signal would be given. The Apache would strike hard and fast, overwhelming the settlers before they could react. Jake's heart pounded as they made their final approach. The sound of the wind and the distant murmurs of the settlers' camp were the only things that broke the silence. As they neared the camp, Jake's thoughts raced. He thought about his life in the desert, how simple it had been before all of this. He thought about the Apache women, who had come into his life so unexpectedly and had become a part of him in ways he hadn't imagined. And now he was about to fight alongside them to protect the land that had given him a sense of belonging. The signal was given, one sharp cry from Tawny, and the Apache women sprang into action. Sita and Lenny moved like shadows, slipping past the settlers' camp and setting fires at key points. At the same time, Jake and Tawny led the charge from the front. They moved quickly, their horses galloping across the open ground. The settlers were caught off guard, scrambling to grab their weapons as the Apache descended upon them. Jake's heart raced as he fought alongside Tawny, Sita, and Lenny. The battle was chaotic, quick strikes, movements in the dark, and the sounds of arrows and rifle shots. But the Apache knew the land better than anyone, and they fought with a ferocity that surprised the settlers. The first wave of the attack was fast and decisive. The settlers, disoriented and unprepared, were forced to retreat. But Jake knew it wasn't over. The settlers had numbers on their side, and they would regroup. The Apache couldn't afford to let up. They had to keep pushing, keep fighting, until the settlers were driven out of their land for good. The battle raged on through the night, but as dawn broke, the Apache had gained the upper hand. The settlers, disorganized and demoralized, were forced to flee. Jake, exhausted and covered in dust, watched as they disappeared into the distance, leaving behind their tents and belongings. The desert was still once more, the only sound the wind shifting through the sand. The Apache women stood together, their faces grim but proud. Tawny looked at Jake, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," she said quietly. Jake nodded, his throat tight. "We fought for what was ours. The land had been won back, but it had come at a cost. The battle had been hard, and the scars of it would stay with them for a long time. But in that moment, Jake knew that he was part of something bigger, something that could not be taken away. The Apache had fought for their land, for their way of life, and they had won. As they rode back to their camp, Jake looked at the 3 Apache women by his side, Tawny, Sita, and Lenny, and realized that he had found something more than just peace in the desert. He had found a family, a connection to a history, and a place where he truly belonged. The desert was no longer just a place of solitude for Jake. It was home.